Okay, so first of all, there's a pretty important verse cited in the Talmud, which actually has some pretty odd ramifications in regards to modern Jewish tradition. Basically, it's discussing cleaning for Passover in Tractate Pesachim. Try to guess what that one's about. It's about Passover. One of the more important laws of which is to not eat any bread or leavened stuff during this holiday, and instead eat matzah, which is like a cracker, sort of. In addition, you can't have any bread in your house, so prior to this holiday, you need to thoroughly clean your entire house out of any bread, and also maybe wrap everything in tin foil to be safe. That's a whole thing. So you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with death or the requisite cheating of it? And yeah, we're getting there. Basically, a case is mentioned where, what if somebody has a hole in their wall that you need to clean inside of, but most people aren't too comfortable sticking their hand into a random hole in their wall that they can't see the other end of, and there could be something sharp in there, maybe, so it asks if you need to clean such a region, and the answer is yes, and the reason why is because there's a rule, which is, in Hebrew, Shluchei mitzvah eine nizikin, which literally means somebody on the way to do a good deed, a mitzvah, will have no harm come to them. And by the way it's phrased, and the case and following cases that it mentions in it, this doesn't just seem to be, a platitude. This is a law in the most literal sense. Somebody who is going to go and do something good, a good deed of some sort, cannot have harm befall them. Now, pretty obvious question you might have, which is, but wait, practically, there are people who go out to do good things, and unfortunately, occasionally harm does befall them, which is a very good question and is actually immediately asked by the Talmud and then answered. Basically, it says that if danger in such a case is commonplace or likely, well, there's only so much the situation can be helped, and the natural results of the situation could fall out. So the implication seems to be that this is good for just like a general protective shell, or to maybe tip the odds in your favor, but won't help pull off something too crazy. This actually has some pretty interesting ramifications with a small little tradition that I've seen some people do, which is before, say, taking a flight, they'll have somebody give them some money, just a coin or two, to be delivered to charity in a charity box in the location of their arrival once they get there and their plane lands. So as they fly, they're taking a coin on the path to do a good deed, hence they fall under this category of a person on their way to do a good deed, and are thus immune to any harm, maybe. I guess it's meant to keep the plane flying straight. I don't know how well this one works. I mean, you're apparently more likely to have a car crash than a plane crash in the first place, and all of this feels more like a loophole. But hey, if it makes people feel safe, then great, and if it works, it works. I have yet to see anybody get into an airplane crash using this method, thank God, so yeah, it has pretty good odds of working by my metric. Okay, point 2. Story time. Or, well, several stories, that is, from the Talmud. Firstly, King David. King David is a pretty important figure in the Torah. I don't feel like he needs too much introduction, but there's an odd point with his birth and death. Basically, according to tradition, when a person is born, he is assigned a certain number of years in his life to live out, and, well, David was unfortunately assigned 0. None. Nothing. So, Adam, the first man, found out about this and disagreed, wanting King David to have some time to live in the world. So he made a deal with God and took off the last 70 years of his life and gave it over to King David, thus making Adam die at the age of 930 instead of apparently 1000, and David living to 70. But how did David die? It says famously that it was a Shabbos and David was learning, as he did, when the angel of death showed up to take his soul. However, apparently the angel was physically physically unable to do so, as King David was learning, and the angel couldn't kill him while he was doing that. So it waited a while, but David never stopped learning without any breaks whatsoever, so the angel had enough and went outside and decided to shove a tree over. David got up to see what happened, learning all the while, of course, without any interruptions, and walked down a staircase, but the staircase broke as he walked, causing him to stop studying for just an instant, allowing the angel to swoop in and grab David's soul. In fact, a very similar incident is mentioned about one of the Talmudic sages, Rabbi Chizda particularly, citing a very similar story about him. So that's point number 2. I guess the implication is that if you keep learning and literally never stop ever forever, you'll never be able to die of natural causes, I'd have to presume. I don't know how well this will help against other methods. I don't know how you'll get around not sleeping, but whatever, you can figure out that step when you get there, cross that bridge when you come to it. Okay, point 3. Yet another story from the Talmud. This one about a Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who was dying, so the angel of death went to visit him beforehand. So the rabbi asked him a favor. Basically, he wanted to know if he could really quickly travel with death and see his place in heaven. So the angel agreed, but the rabbi asked him if he could hold on to the angel of death's sword. Bit of a tangent, but yeah, apparently death doesn't have a scythe, as the imagery is usually. It has a sword, which is coated in poison of some sort, and he holds it above a person's mouth and drops poison into their mouth to claim their soul. Question about how much of this is metaphorical or how much is literal. I'd have to assume very little is literal. I don't think there's literally an angel with a poison sword, but I don't know, maybe. Anyways, the rabbi asked him if he could really quickly please hold on to the blade, and the angel said, okay, fine. So they got there, and the sage immediately jumped into heaven, keeping the blade and refusing to return it so nobody else could die. So it caused a whole issue and tumult, and everyone argued about it for a while. In the end, they agreed the sage could stay, but he had to return the sword, which he did. It wouldn't be the first time the sages meddled in such affairs. I might do a small video about the time they gathered together and entirely banished the human desire to serve idols, which is a whole thing, and they try to banish other things, and that went less well, but whatever, it's not too relevant, so we'll move on. This is another one. I don't know how well it works because it didn't really succeed the first time, and there's a different story where somebody tried the same strategy and the angel said absolutely not because he had been fooled the first time, and that wasn't going to happen again. In addition to all of this, there's just a general thing about certain people apparently never properly dying. I guess it says about Jacob, the forefather, that, quote, he never died. And in fact, when Esau, his twin brother, was eventually killed by having his head struck off during a dispute over Jacob's grave, Esau's head rolled into Jacob's lap and he smiled. In addition, there's a point in the Talmud about this one sage who passed away, and I guess didn't really care too much about that and got up every Shabbos to visit his family and say Kiddush for them. Not sure how you'd go about that, but I guess that's also a thing. In fact, there's a more ordinary method of getting about this. There are certain commandments in the Torah which have the promise of long life granted for keeping them. Things like honoring your mother and father, or Shiluach Hakan, which means that if you want to grab eggs from a nest, you need to first send away the mother bird. Although, you don't want to end up like Acher, the other, who was once known as Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya, who witnessed a child do this commandment, shooing away a mother bird, and then immediately get bitten by a snake and die. So, after already being disillusioned by the very recent destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the Bar Kokhba revolt, and now this, he became a heretic and would go and do all sorts of unfortunate things. This whole story and topic is a whole source of much debate and discussion, but irregardless, that's a very important point, and probably your best bet, which is to, honor your parents, which is something hopefully most people should be doing already. Although, more realistically, in regards to death, it's not exactly an easy thing to get around. The famous legend of the appointment in Samarra comes to mind, a story about somebody who seeks to cheat death by fleeing to a different city, but in the end only ends up arriving at the location of his death in said city, greeted by Death himself right on time. In fact, this story is actually originally derived from, you guessed it, the Talmud, where it says that King Solomon sent somebody to the city of Luz to avoid death, but in the end that man simply found death waiting at that location for him, exactly as intended all along. So, realistically speaking, death comes for us all in the end, much as we'd like to avoid it. In the end, it's only really a matter of what we do with our time while we're still here, before we have to go. But does it? In actuality, there's actually a much simpler and much more legitimate point than all the previous, which is that of the coming of Moshiach, the Messiah, which is in Judaism the entire point of, well, basically everything, it being the ending time of peace, prosperity, and happiness for all humanity, forever, once the world is made into a good enough place through our good deeds. A period which notably lacks anything resembling war, violence, intolerance, hatred, or, of course, death. In fact, a very important fundamental belief in regards to the coming of Moshiach is that of the resurrection of the dead, where literally everybody ever gets to come back to life, just, like that. So, I guess everybody really does get to cheat death in the end, in a sense, sort of. Now, this whole thing is quite a lot more difficult than the previous points. Nonetheless, it's still like the most important thing in Judaism, so definitely something to do. Hopefully soon, I guess, and fast, though, as is said, speedily in our days.